Okay, this is the activity for Chapter 7, the axial skeleton. We'll start with Part 1, which is identification. So we're going to look at several views of the skull. How many bones can you identify? How many bone markings can you identify? Like with the other in-class activities, this will help you if you try to do this at home before watching this video to get the answers. So here is a frontal view of the skull. And just a reminder, when you're looking at these plastic skulls that we find in our labs, when you see the orange-yellow lines, these represent sutures or the connection between one bone and another, so it helps you to know where one bone starts and one bone ends. So the first bone that we can see in this image is the frontal bone. So it's highlighted here in light red. So this entire bone up here is the frontal bone. The next bone that we can identify is the sphenoid, which forms the back of the orbit. So again, I've highlighted it for you to help you see. So you have the two parts of the sphenoid. This is actually two of the wings. This is the bone that looks like a butterfly or bat when you remove it. The next bone is the zygomatic bone. These are your cheekbones. And again, you have two of these. You have one on each side. And again, I've highlighted them for you. The next bone is the inferior nasal concha. So remember, you have a superior and a middle nasal concha as well, but they are part of the ethmoid. The inferior nasal concha, and again, you have one on each side, they are bones all by themselves. So they're these small little bones at the bottom on the sides, lateral walls of the nasal cavity. The next bone is the maxilla. So notice that the maxilla is the bone that contains the upper teeth. Notice also that the maxilla runs all the way up to form the lateral part of the orbits. And also notice that the maxilla is two separate bones that come together and fuse during development. And if they don't fuse completely, then you actually get what's called a cleft palate. Another bone we can identify here is the mandible. This is a single bone, and this is your lower jawbone. It has your lower teeth in it. Another bone that we can identify here are the two nasal bones. So you have two of these, and they form the bridge of the nose. And again, you can see the orange-yellow line representing the sutures, dividing one from the next one. Another bone that we can see here is a bit of the ethmoid bone. So the ethmoid bone makes up both the superior and middle nasal conchae, and we can see the middle one here. The superior one is way up there and you can't see it. And the ethmoid also forms the superior part of the bony nasal septum. So part of the nasal septum between your right and left nostrils is made of cartilage, but it also has a bony component to it, and the superior most bony component is made up of the ethmoid. So another bone that we can see in this image is the vomer, and the vomer forms the inferior most part of the bony nasal septum, as highlighted here in red. So remember, the top part is the ethmoid, the bottom part is the vomer. So that is it for the bones that we can see in this view. Now let's see which of the bone markings we can see. And remember, we are not covering all of the bone markings that are in your textbook, so use the learning objectives to know which ones to study. So in this view, we can see the supraorbital margin, which is the thick bony ridge on the frontal bone that goes right over the orbit, which is the socket where your eye sits. It helps to offer protection for the eyes. In this view, we can also see the optic canal, which is this small hole in the sphenoid bone. Remember, the sphenoid bone was in the back of the eye sockets. This larger hole is not a structure that you need to know, but you do need to know the smaller optic canal. And then the last marking that we can see in this view is the orbital rim of the maxilla. And so that is the part of the maxilla that forms the inferior medial rim of the eye. So that is all of the bones and bone markings that you should have identified on this particular image. Okay, so now we're going to look at the second picture, which is a lateral view of the skull. And first we're going to name the bones. And we'll start with the frontal bone, which again is one of the large cranial bones at the front of the skull. Moving sort of down on the left side, we can next see the nasal bone. So remember, you have two of these. In the lateral view, you can only see one. They form the bridge of the nose. And then we have the lacrimal bones. So these are those very small bones that are at the corner of each eye where your lacrimal ducts are. And then just behind the lacrimal bone, you can see a little bit of the ethmoid, which forms the intermedial wall of the orbit. We can also see the maxilla, which again forms your upper jaw, but also goes upward to form part of the nasal complex and the orbital complex. We can also see the zygomatic bone or the cheekbone. So you have two of these. We can't see the one on the other side, but that is the zygomatic bone. We can also see the mandible or lower jaw, which is all one bone. You can also see a little bit of the sphenoid on the lateral view of the skull. So it's highlighted here for you to see where you can see it on the side. You can also see the parietal bone, which is another one of the cranial bones. You can also see the temporal bone, and you can see all the little processes that come off the temporal bone, which we'll talk about in just a moment. And finally, you can see a little smidge of the occipital bone. You don't get the best view from the lateral view, but you can see a little bit of it. So that is all of the bones, and then on the next slide we'll go over the different markings that you can see. So using the same lateral view, we're going to look at some of the bone markings. So we'll start with the mandible. So the structure on the mandible that looks a little bit like a shark's fin, you can't quite see the top because it's hiding behind the zygomatic bone. That is the coronoid process, and that is an attachment site for muscles like the temporalis. Also on the mandible, you can see the condylar process, which is the more rounded process at the posterior side of the mandible. This is the part that is going to form a joint with the temporal bone, and this will be the temporomandibular joint, or TMJ. Speaking of the temporal bone, we can see quite a few bone markings on it. Starting with the external acoustic meatus, that is this hole here in the side that is going to form your ear canal and go inwards toward your inner ear, which is embedded in the temporal bone. You can also see this large bump. You can feel this bump right behind your ear. This is called the mastoid process. And you can also see the styloid process that comes down from the bottom of the temporal bone. It looks a little bit like a fang. So those are some of the markings. I'm going to go to the next slide to look at additional markings. So we can also see the temporal process on the zygomatic bone. So remember, the zygomatic bone is this bone right here. So this part that is sticking off the posterior side, that is the temporal process, so named because it touches the temporal bone. Remember this diagonal line that's sort of orangey yellow color, that is a suture. That is where the zygomatic bone and the temporal bone connect. So that is why this is called the temporal process on the zygomatic bone, because it's connecting to the temporal bone. We also have a zygomatic process on the temporal bone, again so named because it is touching the zygomatic bone. So that's the zygomatic process on the temporal bone, and the two of those together make up the structure we call the zygomatic arch. So again, the zygomatic arch is composed of the temporal process on the zygomatic bone and the zygomatic process on the temporal bone. We can also see some sutures on this view of the skull. So we have the coronal suture, which connects the frontal bone with the parietal bone. And we can also see the squamous suture, which connects the parietal bone with the temporal bone. Now we are going to look at this inferior view of the skull, and as we did before, we're going to start by naming some bones. So we'll start with the maxilla. So remember, again, this forms your upper jaw, and it forms the anterior-most part of the roof of your mouth. And then again, notice that it was two bones that came together and fused during development. So again, if these two bones didn't fuse properly, you would be left with a cleft palate. You can also see the sphenoid from the inferior view. In fact, the inferior view gives you your best look at looking at how it looks like a butterfly or a bat shape. You can also see your two temporal bones from the inferior view. They are highlighted here. We get a good view of the occipital bone, which is the bone at the back and base of your skull. We can see a little bit of the zygomatic bone from the inferior view, as highlighted here on both sides. We can also see the palatine bone, which forms the posterior part of the roof of your mouth. So the anterior part is the maxilla, the posterior part is the palatine bone. And then we can see a little bit of the vomer. So the bottom of the vomer is visible on the inferior view. Remember, the vomer goes up and forms the inferior part of your bony nasal septum. So that is the major bones that we can see from this angle. Now let's look at some of the bone markings. So we'll start with the temporal process of the zygomatic bone. Again, this is a process on the zygomatic bone, and it's named because it touches the temporal bone. And then this is the zygomatic process of the temporal bone. Again, it's a process of the temporal bone that touches the zygomatic bone. And together, these two make up the zygomatic arch. So it is two separate bones, and you can see the suture line. It's a little bit darker yellow in this highlighted image. But together, those two processes make up the zygomatic arch. If we look down at the occipital bone, we can see the occipital condyles. So there is one on either side. These are going to form a joint with the atlas. So those superior articular processes of the atlas will align up with these two regions, and it'll make that joint that allows you to nod your head up and down like you're saying yes. And then you can also see the foramen magnum, which in Latin literally means big hole. And that is the hole that the spinal cord and the lower part of the brain, called the medulla oblongata, will pass through. Okay, and we'll look at a few more. We can also barely see the external acoustic meatus, which is part of the temporal bone. So it is a slight little hole that you'll be able to see on both sides. And again, that is the start of your ear canal. You can also see this large lump that you can feel behind your ear. That is the mastoid process, and that is also part of the temporal bone. And then of all of the different holes that you can see, there are only two you need to know. The carotid canal is this one here, and this is going to be the hole through which the internal carotid artery passes. And then just below that is the jugular foramen. We say it belongs to the temporal bone, but more accurately, it sits right on top of the suture between the temporal bone and the occipital bone. But for ease, we'll just say it belongs to the temporal bone. So the jugular foramen, you can really see the hole on the right side. On the left side over here, you can't exactly see it because it's slightly angled, but it's there. So remember that the jugular foramen sits just underneath the carotid canal on both sides. And this is where the internal jugular vein will drain blood away from the vein and back to the rest of the cardiovascular system. We can also see the styloid processes of the temporal bone. You may have to squint a little because these are those little fang-shaped processes that are sticking straight down. So in this view, they are coming straight out at you. So it can be a little hard to see. If I turn off the highlight, maybe you can see them there. So they are sticking out straight at you in this particular view. In part 2, we're going to look at some x-rays and see what bones and bone markings we can identify on these. So number 4 says, look at the x-ray below. This x-ray is taken of a person with their face slightly upturned. How many bones and other features can you identify? So to understand the view that you're looking at, the person who's having this x-ray taken has their head looking up like this image. So you can see the bottom of the jawbone right here, and so the eyes are like looking upward. So that should help you orient yourself to this picture. So these 2 dark spots here are the 2 orbits of the eyes. So the frontal bone would be this bone up here at the very top. And we can see the supraorbital margins of the frontal bone, which is the bony ridge just above the orbit on both sides. The interesting thing about x-rays is x-rays also allow you to see air pockets, so you can see the sinuses as well. So these 2 large darker areas between the orbits in the frontal bone, these are your frontal sinuses. And I have outlined one of them for you in yellow, and then there's one on the other side as well. So that's an example of a frontal sinus, and these are visible on x-rays. You don't typically get to see these on the skull models in lab because they're inside the bone, so they're only visible with an x-ray. Likewise, we have a maxillary sinus here. There's one on the other side as well. And this is going to be in the bone called the maxilla. So remember, the maxilla is making up the bone that holds the upper teeth. It's on either side of the nasal cavity and just below the eyes. So this is the maxillary sinus in the maxilla. And we can also see the zygomatic arch. And again, I've outlined one for you. You can also see the one on the other side of the image. Remember, the zygomatic arch is made up of processes from the zygomatic bone and the temporal bone. So even though on this x-ray we can't see sutures, we can assume that the front part of this arch is the zygomatic bone, and so the part that makes up the arch would be the temporal process of the zygomatic bone, and then the bone in the back would be the temporal bone, and this would be the zygomatic process of the temporal bone that's attaching to the temporal process of the zygomatic bone. All right, so that's the zygomatic arch. We can also see the hyoid bone down here underneath the jaw. Remember, this is the one bone that's not directly connected to another bone. It is attached by ligaments to the styloid process of the temporal bone. You can also see the mandible here, which is the lower jaw. And you can see a bit of the coronoid process, which is that shark fin shaped structure. And again, you can see one on this side as well. You can't really see the condylar process very well. That's the one that's going back and forming a joint with the temporal bone. This isn't a good view for that, but you can see the 2 coronoid processes. And then you can see the dens of the axis sticking up back here too. So the dens is a process that comes off of the axis, which is the 2nd cervical vertebrae. So that's visible at the back as well. You might have also identified the vomer as being the bottom part of the bony nasal septum. You might have also mentioned the ethmoid, which is the top part of the bony nasal septum, but I just wanted to point out these other major structures. Number 5, look at the x-ray below. What bones can you identify? What type of vertebrae are these? What features distinguish these vertebrae from the others? And what type of curve do you find in this area? So let's first look at bones and bone markings. So you can see the occipital bone in this image. You can also see the mandible. Looks like this person's missing a tooth or 2. Then you can see the top cervical vertebrae, which is called the atlas. Underneath that, you can see the axis, which is the 2nd cervical vertebrae. And if you look very closely, you can see the dens sticking up from the axis and forming that joint with the atlas. You can also see cervical vertebrae 3, 4, 5, and 6, so C3 through C6. C7 has a special name. Remember, it's the vertebra prominens. If you look down the back of these vertebrae, you'll see this is the first one that sticks way out, and it can form that little bulge that you can feel at the base of your neck because it has a wide tubercle on the end. You can also just start to see the start of the thoracic vertebrae, so that it has T1 is down here at the bottom. You can see the hyoid bone again. Remember, this is a bone that's not directly connected to any other bone, but is connected by ligaments to the styloid process of the temporal bone. And the spaces that you see between the vertebral bodies, those are full of intervertebral discs, which are made of fibrocartilage. So you can see those between each of the vertebral bodies. So we'll look at the second part of the question now. What type of vertebrae are these? Even though we have one T1, these are primarily cervical vertebrae. You can see all 7 cervical vertebrae in this image. So distinguishing features of cervical vertebrae, they have a small oval vertebral body. The vertebral foramen is large compared to the size of the body. The spinous process, that's the one that sticks off the back. It points inferiorly and it has that bifid tip. You can't see that in the x-ray, but it has the bifid tip, meaning it's split at the end. And they have the transverse foramina, which means their transverse processes come together to fuse to make the 2 little holes on the sides. And the cervical curve is an example of a secondary curve. It doesn't develop until you learn to hold the weight of your head above your neck as a baby, so holding your head up for the first time. Number 6 says, look at the x-ray below. What bones can you identify? What type of vertebrae are these? What features distinguish these vertebrae from others? And what type of curve do you find in this area? So notice we have 2 views. The view on the left is a lateral view, and the view on the right is an anterior-posterior view. So you can see all of the thoracic vertebrae in this image, T1 to T12. Remember, you have 12 thoracic vertebrae. You can also see the ribs. So one of the things that make thoracic vertebrae unique is that they form joints with your ribs. So in both the lateral and anterior-posterior image, you can see the ribs coming in and forming the joints with the thoracic vertebrae. You can also see L1, which is the first lumbar vertebrae at the very bottom. And we can again see the intervertebral discs, which are the spaces between the vertebral bodies where you find that pad of fibrocartilage. So to answer the second part of the question, these are primarily thoracic vertebrae, and again you have 12 of them. Their features are that they have a medium heart-shaped vertebral body. The vertebral foramen is round and not as large as the body like we saw in the cervical vertebrae. There are facets for rib articulations on both the vertebral body and the transverse processes. So remember, ribs 1 through 10 are going to attach to the thoracic vertebrae in 2 locations, 1 location on the body and 1 location on the transverse process. And they also have long, slender spinous processes that point inferiorly. And if you look at this left image, the lateral view, you kind of have to look really hard to see those spinal processes. But I did highlight one so that you can see this is a single thoracic vertebrae. And you can see that their spinous processes are not only slender, but they very much point in a downward direction. And the thoracic curve is a primary curve. So it's that C-shape primary curve that you're born with. Question 7, look at the x-ray below. What bones can you identify? What type of vertebrae are these? What features distinguish these vertebrae from the others? What type of curve do you find in this area? So these are your massive lumbar vertebrae. You have 5 of them, and they are labeled L1 to L5. So these are the ones that are going to have the most massive vertebral body. So you can see in the x-ray just how large they are. We also can see T12 at the very top of this image, so that's the 12th thoracic vertebrae. And then we can also see the sacrum down here. And the sacrum, remember, consists of 5 fused vertebrae labeled S1 to S5. You can also see the intervertebral discs in between the vertebral bodies, or more accurately, you can see the space where the discs are. And remember, the intervertebral discs are made of fibrocartilage. And once you get down to the lower back, not only are the vertebral bodies larger, but the discs are larger as well. And that is because this is the part of the spine that is carrying most of the body's weight. So most of the body's weight is funneled into the lower back or the lumbar region. And if you're curious about what this is over here, that is gas in the intestines. Remember, gas is not radio opaque, so it shows up as dark areas on X-rays. All right, and so if we answer the second part of the question, and my little highlight came up a little early, but these are mainly lumbar vertebrae. They are featured with a massive oval-shaped vertebral body. The vertebral foramen is small in comparison to the size of the body and triangular in shape. They have blunt, short spinous processes and transverse processes. And the spinous processes point posteriorly, and I highlighted one here for you so you can see how it points more directly in the dorsal direction versus when we looked at the thoracic vertebrae, and they definitely pointed in a way more downward direction. And the lumbar curve is a secondary spinal curve. It develops when you learn to stand and walk. So notice it's the opposite of the C shape. Number 8, what bone is shown below in blue? What are the different parts of this bone? So this is the sternum. You used to call it your breastbone, but now you're going to call it the sternum. The top part is called the manubrium. The middle part is called the body. And the bottom part that's got the little pointy end is the xiphoid process. Notice that the light blue areas in this picture are your costal cartilages that connect the ribs to the sternum, and these are composed of hyaline cartilage. Number 9, what bone is shown below? Identify the major parts of this bone. So the bone that stands out the most in this image is going to be the mandible, or your lower jawbone. Now, if you also identified the maxilla, that's a good job. So the maxilla is the part that contains your upper teeth. You can also see a bit of the zygomatic bone in this image as well. And the zygomatic bone is attached to the temporal bone. And in this particular image, we actually can see the suture right in the middle of the zygomatic arch. So remember, this is the temporal process of the zygomatic bone forming a joint with the zygomatic process of the temporal bone. But if we go back to the mandible, the 2 major parts of the mandible that you need to know are the condylar process. And remember, when you see the word condyle, it has to do with a joint. So this is where the mandible is forming a joint with the temporal bone. So this is the temporomandibular joint, or TMJ. So that is the condylar process of the mandible. And then this is the coronoid process of the mandible. It's the one that looks like a shark's fin. And this is where you have the attachment of a really large muscle in your head called the temporalis that we'll look at later this semester. Also, things that you can see in this picture that are kind of interesting. You can see the external acoustic meatus. It actually sits right behind the temporomandibular joint. And this is where your ear canal is, and this is in the temporal bone. And you can also see the mastoid process, which is that big bump on the temporal bone that sits right behind your ear. And if you also notice that you can see some vertebrae, that's good too. We're just not going to identify those at this point. And that is it for Chapter 7, Activity.